Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is August 31st, year 2021, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Here we are at the end of the month. My gosh, summer's almost over. I guess for some people, it already is, or maybe it never started. Maybe this is all just one giant holographic representation. Maybe it's just a giant collective hallucination. Well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because today I'm going to be giving a talk about Philip K. Dick, yes, or PKD, as the insiders know him as. And he's not such a boutique taste anymore. He's about as mainstream as you can get, which is not, I'm not critical of that. I'm happy for him. I'm glad that there is a critical mass of people, an audience out there who can accept his message. The problem is that I think for the majority of the audience, they don't realize how true his message is and how close it is. Well, not close, how his message is really consistent with our contemporary form of psychoslavery, right? He was intimating to us what he himself had experienced from a very young age as a child through early adulthood and then his mature years as his work began to gain notoriety. He was gaining recognition because, the reality was already there, but the literature was starting to pour in about paperclip, about the so-called counterculture. Remember the church hearings, congressional hearings, led by Senator Frank Church, 1976. All that information, this is post-Watergate, too, information, and all the assassination, supposed, as the CIA called it, conspiracy theories, these are all coming to bear, right? And we in 2021 are the beneficiaries of that. However, there still is a lag between all that storehouse of information and what's going on in 2021. And that is exactly what I excel in, right? And I'm telling you this because I get all these comments about, oh yeah, you got to look at the Kennedy assassination and Lee Harvey Oswald was not the lone gunman and blah, 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 woof, woof. And I hear it all the time, So I'm telling you, I'm, and I'll explain I'll give you my bona fides later. Because UC Davis is part of the story here, which you'll hear in a minute. And because of the insights I got, it got me into hot water. So that tells me that I'm on top of it. And you're the beneficiary of it right here. And so spread this talk. Give your friends and neighbors some information or some insight into this channel. It must be suppressed or something. It should have far more than less than 7,000 subscribers, but that's okay because PKD himself was in a ghettoized genre of literature, science fiction. In fact, there was a biographical passage where PK Dick was at a party with his wife at the time, amongst some self-styled San Francisco literary personages. And he mentioned, just in passing, not bragging, that he had just sold a novel. And they said, oh, wow, it's, because they're writers. Everybody wants a contract, right? And they said, oh, what is it about? And he said, well, it's about this, this, and this. And then they realized, oh, my gosh, he's a science fiction writer. And they laughed at him. Because science fiction back then wasn't what it is today. It's an industry now, and it's not a mark of shame to be a science fiction writer. It's cool, really, to be a science fiction writer. But then it was like being a pornographer or some sort of less than reputable type of activity, right? You're a jazz musician or a blues musician or something like that. You're like a junkie, you're like a prostitute, you're not a literary person. So you get what I mean. So today I'm going to be using PKD as a jumping off point to something much, much substantial, not more substantial than PK Dick, but he, like I said, he was intimating something that was deeper and larger than himself. And I'm going to be giving you some insights that I have acquired over the past few years to flesh this out, to kind of sketch it out for you, because we are prisoners of this world that PK Dick was going through in his early years and in the peak year when it started to really hit in 1970s, the 60s, late 60s through 70s. That's when it really started to roll out. But the problem is that what PK Dick was warning us against has triumphed. It has prevailed. I think one of the reasons why PKD is so popular now is because he's safe. He's been denatured. He's deemed as no longer, his work is deemed as no longer a threat to the larger military industrial pharmaceutical complex. And by the way, I should state at the outset that in the course of this talk, I don't mean to be insulting anybody who's on pharmaceutical preparations of any sort, so-called antidepressants or so-called psychotropic drugs. And the reason I don't pass judgment on you, because I realize the degree to which the majority of the population has been enslaved into that regime. And I'm here to tell you that that's not inevitable. And PKD is sending us a message. If we read it correctly, him and other people, such as the wonderful Dr. Peter Bregan, MD, medical doctor, he gave I think it was about an hour-long interview. Check it out. It's on band.com. He gave an extensive interview, and Alex Jones didn't even interrupt, surprisingly. But he gave about an hour-long interview talking about how psychiatry itself went from a truly helping profession to one that has become an adjunct of big pharma, right? The same people who want to bring us into this regime. I'm not going to go into more specifics. You know what I mean? But first they try to get our minds. Now they're getting our genetics. They think they are, but they're not going to win, because we have great writers and thinkers and just, reporters, investigative journalists, people from all walks of life who can break it. Intelligent readers. I'm going to have one such intelligent reader. I'm not going to give you her name now. In the next week or so. She is one of the Patreon people, and she watches this channel regularly. And I happened to mention a book, a piece of fiction by Thomas Pynchon, and she followed up on it. This is months ago, and took extensive notes. So we'll be going in on Thomas Pynchon himself. He's also a figure who is helping us to understand 2021. This is why we need our humanities as part of the curriculum. That's why it's being destroyed, so that people who are in the scientific technocracy, people wearing the white coats, people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dr. Deborah Birx, and Peter Daszak, people like that have cultural, political, and social authority. They have legislative authority over our lives, and that's not right. That cannot stand. So we have PKD to thank for that. And we also have people to thank who unwittingly have unmasked their own game. And one such person is Dr. Paul Ekman. He's not a medical doctor. He's a PhD, but he's had much more influence than your average, even celebrity MD, like Dr. Anthony Fauci. In fact, Time magazine declared as such. He's declared or anointed as being the 100 most important people in American society. I don't know what the time frame is, but he's up there. He's in the top 100. And I'll explain to you how he got there, why he got there, and the dangers that this lionization of Dr. Paul Ekman, the dangers of that, and how we can pull out of it. Because it's a law of the universe. If there's a problem, there's also a solution, right? If there's a poison, there's an antidote to that as well. So I'm going to be combining these two figures, one PKD coming from one extreme, and the other, Paul Ekman, coming from another. The establishment, the psychiatric slash psychological, psychotherapeutic establishment. And by the way, it's just as I'm not being critical or mocking those who are or have been or are going to be on psychotropic medications. I don't want to pass judgment on people who have been in psychotherapy, are in psychotherapy, or will be in psychotherapy, or are practicing psychotherapists or MFCC people or social workers, right? Because you're important. You have an incredible opportunity here to reform, if not walk away from your existing institutions, so that we human beings can regain our sanity. Because the madness that we're seeing now is engineered, almost all of it is. So we'll bring some sobriety to this discussion here. So I'm your friend, all right? I'm not a hater. And I've learned to be less judgmental, as they say, about people. It's the kinder, gentler self that we all, or at least I wished I'd always become. So I would also, just as a primer for those who are new to this discussion. Oh, by the way, before I get really into this, I want to welcome Mom with Bulldogs, Corky Goss, Agatha Velvet. That's a new name in the chat room. It brings in one of my favorite words, Agatha Christie and Blue Velvet, or, National Velvet, if you will. And then there's Oga Nostra, Les H, Hari Harkonnen. Are you coming from a Scandinavian country? Finland, perhaps? That's wonderful. Welcome. ECAT, hi. Yeah. Of course, we know who ECAT is. Debbie Zapina, Sean Mahoney. Oh, Kathy Sue. Hey, how you doing? And Ralph Winter. I'm sorry, the print is real small here. Okay, and Piper Fogel. Okay, I'm gonna go on. There's tons of you here. Great, because you're gonna want to hear some of my conclusions. But first, for those of you who are new to this channel, watch some of the ASMR readings I've been doing. They've gotten really good reception, which I thought they might, because it's a thing on YouTube. And ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. And for 3 years or so, I've been collecting research on it. Believe me, the behavioral scientists are all over it. They're studying it very, very carefully. But you're seeing a lot of it on YouTube. So I said, well, I'm going to experiment with putting information and educational material out using this particular neuropsychological phenomenon called ASMR. And you've heard it. It's usually an Asian woman whispering very carefully into the microphone while she's brushing her teeth or combing her hair. Something like that. Maybe I'll, I won't be doing whispering today, but, maybe I will. And I'll press little switches. This gives you a tingly sensation, supposedly. Right. So that's ASM. So I read some of that. I gave a reading from this book, My Life on the Edge of Reality, and I'm going to get back to it in a moment, just very briefly. I gave an ASMR reading about Philip Dick there. And I did something on, let's see. Yeah, the person who, William Tompkins, who's a aerospace engineer, did something like that. And I have some other material. Now, for those of you who want to get into the deep material, I recommend that you join the Patreon, check it out. And my latest post was with the super soldier, Tiger Woods, the golfer who comes out of Stanford. That should raise a red flag right there. And his wife of 5 years, Elin Nordegren, who came to the U.S. I mentioned this on the Thursday Trio last week with John O'Loughlin and George Webb, who came into the U.S. on an au pair program that is authorized by the U.S. Congress. So on to that Patreon, I'll give you the documents, or they're posted there, of the legislation, and also articles about Tiger Woods as super soldier. So that's the real meaty stuff, and that's the material that I don't even dare to put on YouTube because I only have one strike remaining, and I want to remain on YouTube because I don't want to win the war and suffer 100% casualty rate. So check that out. If you don't like it, well, no harm, no foul. You're out of $5, but there's other material there that goes back. So check that one out. Also, thank you very much for the listeners here. One listener in particular, I won't give any names, gave me the contact information of James Lee, who I mentioned his work last time. And by the way, I put some of his work, I scanned it, put some of his work on Patreon, which he allowed to do in the book. He says, no copyright, just, spread the information. I said, well, that's my kind of guy. So I put that on the Patreon as well. A lot of good graphics and really great analysis by James Lee. So one of you, thank you very much. I'm thanking you without announcing your name to the world. Gave me the contact information. I called him up on the phone, got no answer, sent an email earlier today, and hopefully I'll get something back. And if so, I did invite him on the show, and so that you and I can get more information about all these crazy, so-called wildfires that have been going on. So that's what's been going on lately. So, all right, I already burned up a quarter hour. Let me get into PKD. First of all, let me tell you very quickly how I got into him. I read a Rolling Stone article, Rolling Stone magazine. This is before it went globalist. This is when Rolling Stone was still under the editorial control over its founder, Jan Wenner. And I mention that because today, if you read Rolling Stone, I don't want to confuse you. It's just a bunch of globalist garbage. It's orthodoxy. It's corporatist orthodoxy. But in the older days, the original Rolling Stone, which I used to read as well, was counterculture. It was really an oppositional journalistic voice in the wilderness. So anyway, it was still of that ilk at this point when I read this incredible feature article about this writer named Philip K. Dick, and I didn't know about him. So I had him in mind. I still hadn't read his fiction yet. And then I started getting into it through my friends from Catholic school. I didn't go to Catholic school. These are friends who had attended Catholic school. And the Catholic part of it is important because this is the first time, because I went to public school, this is the first time I realized that there are different curricula out there. They were learning, it was similar to ours, but they were learning extra material, which really intrigued me. They were exploring comparative literature and philosophy and theological issues. And I said, wow, because in public school, it's supposed to be religious free, right? So we never got that. And to me, that's really one of the linchpins of civilization, of life, really, the theological, the religious, the spiritual dimension of life. And we didn't get that in public school. They did. And so some of these friends of mine were heavily into PKD. So, we read them together and we used to talk about him all the time. And in addition to music, because we were all totally into playing, listening, and performing music. So, I read his short stories. I read his novels just like you did. And then, of course, we know about the movie adaptations. I won't go into it. He's mainstream, and I'm not holding that against him or his legacy. And then what was interesting to me was his biographical material that started coming out. And the first two out of the gate were ex-wives of his. And he himself, PKD, described himself as a serial husband, or he was into serial marriage. I don't know where it came from. He might have been because of his pre-hippie, pre-counterculture moral values. But if he had a romantic or a sexual relationship with a woman, he felt he had to divorce his wife, his current spouse, and then marry the person that he was having this relationship with. So he had any number of lies. That must be crazy for the estate lawyers today. But I started reading this material, and I mentioned before that this is available as an ASMR reading, an excerpt of it. But I'm going to go into a book that I won't say is better, but it yielded more hard information that I can share with you today that's going to really, really open your eyes, not just to PKD and the psychiatric establishment, but to the neuropsychiatric control that has got us into our enslavement today, right? You're looking at the NIH and Anthony Fauci and all these bad guys and right, these personalities out there as singular individuals who are standing in the way of our freedom, right? We want to recover it if we just push these people out of the way. Well, I'm sorry to announce to you that the problem is deeper than these personalities, which is one of the reasons why they keep flashing their faces up there. The problem is institutionalized mind control, as we know from, we know the term mind control. I don't like to use it because it itself has become trivialized, just like PKD's legacy is en route to becoming trivialized. So I call it neuropsychiatric politics, neuropolitics, just like biopolitics has taken over our lives, everything that we eat, consume, and there's even free market exchange, marketing of organs, of human organs. Right, that's part of the biopolitical transformation. And there's a neuropsychiatric regime that we moved into, and that contravenes any sort of constitution, written or unwritten, or Republican forms of government, or all the literature that you studied in school. It completely subverts it and contravenes it, and that's what we're locked into right now. So we have to attack it at its base, and I'm going to look at its base. Are you ready? Good. And one of it, and of course, we're going to look at its superstars, including Dr. Paul Ekman. And he's the guy, just briefly, I'll get into a little bit more deeply. He's the guy that is responsible for all these YouTubes about deception, right? Look at body language, and oh yeah, Kamala Harris's left eye twitch, so we know that she's not telling the truth. Well, we don't need to look at micro expressions to know where she comes from or what she's about. Same with Joe Biden and all these so-called independent media that obsess over these little slips of tongue or falling down the stairway to Air Force One, and how could AOC be? I mean, that's part of the distraction there. Okay, so that's where this comes from. This looking at micro expressions. That's Dr. Paul Ekman, who himself has a really interesting background, rooted, guess what, in what is today known as the deep state. Yes, the deep state. Another term that's probably, we'll have to throw it away because it's becoming trivialized. Yeah, these behavioral scientists, so-called, I use that in quotation marks, they're our priesthood, right? You've got David Hare, Hare. He's the guy that claims everybody has a little bit of psychopath in him or her, right? It's the whole Hannibal Lecter, your neighbor, yourself, your husband, your spouse. We're all part psychopath, and he has a whole scale of psychopathy. And of course, he has a very lucrative, I'm sure, corporate consultancy based upon his dubious research. And guess what? Dr. Paul Ekman also has a lucrative side hustle, right? Paul Ekman Associates, which, by the way, is based not in the U.S. These are both Americans, by the way. It's his operations is not based in the U.S. It's based in Manchester, Britain, right? How did they get a hold of it? Oh, wow. Gee, tells me that there's some very, very deep institutional connections there that go beyond Dr. Paul Ekman. I can imagine a scenario where two gentlemen in black suits and sunglasses visited him at the University of California, San Francisco, where he had his career. I'll get into UCSF in a moment. They visited him and say, you got a really good operation here, Dr. Ekman, and we want to buy it from you. And he probably said, hey, I'm going to buy it. It's not for sale. And they said, you don't understand. We want to buy it from you. We're going to give you an offer you can't refuse. And I think he probably, he wanted to stay alive as well as become fabulously wealthy and enjoy the notoriety of being featured on CNN and Us Magazine and People Magazine and the Washington Globe and the New York Compost and Fox News and all of it. It's great being an academic celebrity. How many of those do you know? I'm the only one besides Dr. Paul Ekman, and look at me. I don't even have 7,000 subscribers on YouTube. Oh man. So that's we'll get back into Ekman and Dave. There's all these academic types who have these side hustles, and it's just when you see them on CNN or wherever, just remember it's a side hustle, and with the emphasis on the hustle, because I have nothing against people hustling. I'm a hustler. If you're not hustling, you're not living. So let me first go into his long-standing. I'm talking about now Paul Ekman's long-standing professional relationship with the Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute, and that's what it was known as when he was big time, when he was earning his bones for the New World Order, the psychiatric establishment, because it goes by different names now. I think it's called the Langley Porter Psychiatric Hospital or Clinic, something like that. But it was defined as a neuropsychiatric institute very early on. So here's where PKD, I'm going to say PKD for convenience sake. This is where PKD enters the picture. And this is where biography comes into the analysis. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a big biography junkie, because you get to learn about these characters, right? From people who are in a good position to provide valuable insight, information, or analysis. And one such person is one of his ex-wives. Remember, PKD called himself a serial husband. Her name is Anne A. Dick. You've heard of Tessa Dick. There's another Dick out there. Her name is Anne A. Dick. No pun intended. And she was his wife during the mid-60s, 1960s. And, it was a pretty interesting point in time. This is when the counterculture started to unfold. Some people are claiming that it's engineered. I think it happened. It started organically, and then it was infiltrated like everything else that's good in life. Food and the bounty of nature, what more can you ask for? And then the so-called agronomist at UC Davis got a hold of it and came up with the flavor saver tomato. So anyway, Anne Dick, his wife, wrote a book. What's the title here? I don't know. I don't have it, the title. I'll get it for you later. Oh, here it is. It's The Search for Philip K. Dick, right? Okay. San Francisco Tachyon Publishers, 2010. I didn't check, but it might be still in print. You can get it. I recommend it, even if you're not a PKD fan, because it'll give you a really good insight into the counterculture, and especially one woman, this very special creative woman, who was involved in the arts and crafts movement and lived this sort of bohemian life in the Point Reyes Station area in Northern California with her husband, PKD, and we know about his creativity. So she was with him at this very crucial point in his life. And it is through Anne A. Dick that we find out such crucial information that made the light bulbs go off in my mind and had got me to understand PKD is far more than just a very perceptive and far-seeing an imaginative writer, right? I saw him as being beyond science fiction. I recognized his genius as a person who being very much in tune with the dark history of our times and our earlier history as it has unfolded in the current time. That's what is so great about science fiction. It tells us about what's happening right now at the moment. So here's Anne Dick, and she says in her book, and I've cross-checked a lot of the stuff on my own independently. Okay, I don't just take people's word for it. But she notes that Philip K. Dick dropped out of high school in his senior year. He's a high school dropout, and he never went to college. Probably, that saved him. And as it turns out, the reason why he dropped out of high school is because he was, I don't think she uses the term dissociation, but his center, and I won't use the term ego, his center was falling apart. His identity was beginning to fragment. He was unraveling. Okay, let me put it in lay terms. He was coming apart. So he couldn't go to school anymore. And the reason why he couldn't go to school, ladies and gentlemen, is because Anne A. Dick revealed that he had been going since a child. They were living in Berkeley, him and his mother and his sister, I think a brother or two, Berkeley, California, which looms large in this story. There's a reason why Berkeley was the epicenter of all this craziness, especially Berkeley High School. I think Berkeley High School students have been recruited for generations, I mean, 2 or 3 generations at least, have been recruited to enter these different types of programs. One of them is the guy with Rage Against the Machine, the guitarist. What's his name? I can't remember. He's half African and half white. His mother is a school teacher, and he got a full ride to Harvard, this guy. You know who I'm talking about? He's a leftist too. He's a communist. And he thinks he's a latter-day Woody Guthrie, right? This guitar kills fascists and all that. But he's a mind-controlled guy who moved after he graduated from Harvard, moved to LA to join the music scene and worked as a stripogram artist. What's his name? I think I blocked it out of my brain. He's the guy that does all the scratching on his guitar. You'll put it in the live chat here. Rage Against the Machine, right? So he comes out of Berkeley High School. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off into an aside. So Ann Dick said that Phil from Berkeley to San Francisco, it's right across the bay, but it's a trip. It's a long trip, especially for a kid. He would make that long trip from the East Bay, Berkeley, and I guess the bridge was in. The BART wasn't in back then, so he had to take a bus from Berkeley across the Bay Area Bridge into San Francisco. And once he was in San Francisco, he had to go all the way to I can't remember the area. I guess it's near the park there, but the whole Langley Porter Clinic for Psychotherapy. As a child, he was going there weekly. He was sent there by his mother. He was going there weekly for evaluation, supposedly for psychotherapy. Now, Dick himself thinks that he and others think that he was being evaluated for super soldier type, if not, I use that term super soldier loosely, but he was like Tiger Woods. He was being evaluated for use in a super soldier type program because of his high intelligence, creativity, and certain characteristics that he tested well on. And those of you who are my generation or younger even, and we didn't think it was weird, but do you remember how often we were tested? I mean, the number 2 pencil and the little bubbles and the little Scantron, those were our friends. We were being tested, like all the time. And I didn't realize how weird and bizarre that was until later on. I said, oh my gosh, what whoever they are, probably the Stanford Research Institute, they were trying to figure out who are going to be the people that they can cultivate and make into X, Y, or Z type of professionals, or the ones they'll just kind of let ripen on the vine. So Dick was identified early on as one of these Wunderkind. By the way, this is very similar to the story of, while he later became a doctor, this is very similar to the story of George Hodel of a generation earlier, because George Hodel attended the University of California, San Francisco to get his medical degree. The medical school is not on the Berkeley campus. It's on the other side of the bay. Some people are confused about that. And George Hodel was also part of this cohort that was identified by Friedrich Terman at Stanford University. He was known as one of Terman's termites. Professor Terman at Stanford, they had created these IQ exams. That's the Stanford Binet IQ examination. They had determined that George Hodel had a super high intelligence, and he became one of what were called Terman's termites. And then later on, as you know, if you've been following the leads that Kathy Sue so kindly introduced us into this rabbit hole, you know what Dr. George Hodel morphed into, right? So a generation later, Philip K. Dick was being brought in to a similar type program. And by gosh, if he didn't become a writer, who knows? He would have become, maybe he could have become a serial killer / assassination type of droid, right? Or a super golfer, or some sort of gifted, super talented individual. So here's where Langley Porter comes in, and it's still in existence, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm trying to recreate this from memory, but I think as early as during World War I, there was a movement afoot in the state of California, which was not anywhere as large as it is today, There was a movement afoot in California to bring the psychiatric arts and sciences into institutional life. So as early as World War, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, I have a quality audience here. You know the backstory about Tavistock Institute, right, in London. They came out of World War I because of all these returning veterans who had traumas and they called it shell shock back then, right? So that, and we had, the U.S. and doughboys in a similar situation. But that's really where modern psychiatry got its toehold on a large scale. So Langley Port or something like it was already being talked about around the time of World War I, but it didn't become a reality until after World War II, because that's where the ravages of World War I became further consolidated into this world global centralized government, right? United Nations, 1947, National Security Act of 1947. You've been following John O'Loughlin's channel and you've seen the readings, and he refers to that. His father was one of the unwitting participants in that system, along with many men of that generation, right? And people who weren't in it, civilians, we were the sort of the collateral damage of it. So that's how I contextualize Philip K. Dick. That's the larger framework in which I understand him. His wives, neither of them really, they kind of have an inkling, but I don't think they understand the full scope of institutions like Langley Porter and the University of California, San Francisco, and how the medical psychiatric complex and the industrial dimension of the big pharma institutions, how that articulates with PKD and his work. And I don't think he understood it fully himself. How could he? There was no internet back then. Few people could really piece it together. He could only do it imaginatively. And I think he also did some library work at the UC Berkeley. What's the name of the campus library? I can't remember. Maybe it's just called Berkeley Library. And he did some reading and got to understand the historical basis for what he was putting together. But it was really the type of psychotherapeutic, let's call it generously. I'm being charitable here because I don't want to cast aspersions on some of the good aspects, perhaps, of psychotherapy. Maybe there are some. I don't know of them. I try to avoid it. And just an aside, I'll tell you how dangerous it is. When I was going through my tribulations at the University of California at Davis, which I'll talk about in a moment more in the context of Tessa Dick, they told me, because at this point I had gotten down to a 75% reduction in salary. And they said, we'll make it less and we'll make it a shorter term if you submit to psychotherapeutic regime right here with a therapist of our choice. And of course, that woman, because they're mostly women, by the way, that woman will put the real fix on you and have you written up as a psycho, and you're going to be finished. I mean, I knew this because I've read this material. They chose the wrong chump to work that game on, but it's real. The point here is it's real, and I'm warning you. You submit yourself to that regime, and you might live to regret it. You allow your child or your grandchild to become an experimental test subject like that, and you may live to regret it. So I'm not going to spell that out because that's your decision. I'm not the boss of you, right? Unlike Big Pharma or Anthony Fauci or those guys, I'm not the boss of you. You're the boss of yourself. But hopefully, in listening to this talk, you're gonna put it together yourself, and you don't have to listen to my advice. You're going to come up with these conclusions yourself. So this is what happened to PKD, and he was tormented by it for the rest of his life. In addition to this, I don't know if this happened at the Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute, but he was sodomized, right? This is something that comes up over and over again, and it's not a coincidence. I'm not looking for this. It seems to be a pattern amongst the people that I've been looking at biographically. Sex abuse, and it's not necessarily even sodomy. If you read a little bit more of the Ricky Lee Jones autobiography, you'll read stories about orphanages and and sex abuse, not sodomy, like, male on male type sodomy, anal rape in the case of Philip Dick, but sexual abuse, sexual trauma, right? So it's more prevalent than most of us know, even though some of us may have experienced it or not. Most people, even if they have experience, tend to put it off to the side. But we know enough about psychology that you can't do it. It comes out, and in the case of PKD, it came out in his fiction, and also insofar as his relationships with women, and not just with women, but also just everyday people. He was very charming, high intelligence. He could con the most skeptical medical doctor to prescribing him dozens of different types of drugs, pharmaceuticals. He wasn't into LSD, by the way. He was all his amphetamines came from prescriptions, but he was a con man. He knew how to manipulate people. He wasn't necessarily a nice guy, by the way. He was not very good to women. He was not very good to his wives, not very good to his children. And for whatever reasons, I'm not going to pass judgment. I'm just from what I'm reading, and of course, I know they're biased, right? But he was not necessarily the lovable genius that we see in these documentaries. So I don't want to romanticize him in any way. Yeah. So he went into Langley Porter Critic, his clinic. His mother was fearful that her young son, because he was a teenager by this time, was becoming gay, because Philip Dick had fallen into this gay network of literary people like Philip Lamantia, the poet, Robert Duncan. I don't know his work, Jack Spicer. These are the people that were loosely around, by the way, of the Allen Ginsberg. A little bit later, City Lights Bookstore, right? That group, they were the Beats, right? The post Beats, pre-hippie, between the Beat era and the hippie. You had these people, but there were any number of. This is the burgeoning or the budding gay community, by the way, and a lot of them, by the way, had experienced sexual trauma, sodomy at the hands of the usual suspects, right? So his mother was fearful that he was going to be turned into gay by this cohort that he was hanging out with in San Francisco. And there was also that type of scene, a counterculture that was beginning to come to the fore in the Berkeley area, right? The University of California, Berkeley. But it was also an area, Berkeley in particular, was also a hotly contested zone between the corporate fascists and the hippies and the counterculture type people. And Philip K. Dick, he lived there, and he lived north of there, like Point Reyes and outside of Berkeley, but he could see that tension there between those who were trying to turn us into the national security state of the National Security Act of 1947, right? We're talking about the late 60s, 70s, and getting into the early 80s, especially under the regime of Governor Ronald Reagan. Yes, he was the governor of California before he went to the White House and was almost killed by a family friend of the Bush people, right? And George Bush conveniently was VP. And he survived, Ronald Reagan survived the attack by John Hinckley. So that's the same guy. It's Ronald Reagan. And Reagan was very much committed. And again, I think he got one of those visits by the men in black suits, because before he was governor of California, he was a liberal. He was a social. I think he was a Democrat. He was kind of on the left. He wasn't a rabid corporatist that he. He was an actor. I don't blame Reagan himself. Maybe he himself had been, because he was an actor before, had been manipulated in a way that PKD was. But the point is that PKD was feeling and experiencing this COINTEL, it's called. The FBI's name for it was COINTEL. He was feeling and experiencing this type of political harassment and targeting that people thought was paranoia, right? Today we call it history. We've read it. We know about Chaos. This is a great book. I keep coming back to it, and it's fully indexed, by the way. Tom O'Neill. Check this. This one belongs in your library. He has an irritating way of kind of apologizing for what he found out. I don't think he needs to apologize at all. I think if he just, maybe that's so he can stay sane. I don't know, but he expresses incredulity that all this went down. I mean, it's real. It's a history. But anyway, this is a good book that Philip Dick, he isn't mentioned here specifically, but he's part of that milieu. All right, so let me tell you what how Dick comes into the picture and how the Langley Porter Institute comes in. Well, in Southern California, we had a Dr. Jolyon West, a Jolly West, all right? You know his name, so I don't need to go into it. And he was proposing during the Reagan administration, the governor administration, state of California, he was promoting this Center on Violence to be housed at the University of California, Los Angeles. Now, it didn't get funding directly, but they did. And by the way, I'll put part of this document onto my Patreon. That's one of the benefits my supporters get here. I found it today, and you're going to get it here. It's the actual scan of the typewritten transcript. State of California, State Senate Committee on Health and Welfare, dated April 11, 1973. It's a hearing, 3 o'clock p.m., at the state capitol, Sacramento. And it's the hearing on proposed Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence at UCLA. Just like, I'm not making it up. I have the documents here. And guess who were the witnesses? One was J.M. Stubblebine. That's a name you should know. And the other one was Jolly West. Right. So this is what was going on in not just Dick's life. He was writing about it. This paranoia, this techno-pharmaceutical hallucinogenic paranoia that he was experiencing, writing about, was real. It was not a hallucination. It was going on. It was the politics of the time. So where does Paul, because I'm running out of time here, I might have to devote an entire 1-hour talk to Paul Ekman himself. Where does Paul Ekman fit into the story here? Well, Paul Ekman, as it turned out, and I only found this out a couple months ago. I've been following the Philip K. Dick story for the past 3, 4, 5 years by reading the biographies of these wonderful women who really had a fantastic feel and insight to the mind and the emotional content of PKD. Well, Dr. Paul Ekman was at the Langley Porter Institute around the same time that PKD was, and I haven't found the smoking gun, so to speak. I haven't found the evidence that connects them two, but institutionally, at least, they were connected. I don't know if PKD was one of his patients or he had studied him, but they were part of that same neuropsychiatric control system. That's Paul Ekman. And you might know him better because even though he's, according to Time magazine, one of the top 100 most influential people in the universe, you may not know him. I didn't know him very well. I kind of slightly knew about him. You know, he's kind of a legend in academia, right? Because he's a multimillionaire and he's a celebrity, right? I told you he's been on all these TV shows and magazines. But he was the consultant for a program called Lie to Me that ran 2009, 2011, starring Eric Roth. This is Fox TV. And I went ahead and bought that series. I bought it in February 6, 2020, because I do my research. I wanted to see this. I wanted to check out who Dr. Paul Ekman is. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't know that he was affiliated with the Langley Porter Clinic. And I had kind of forgotten about that connection in reading these books. But then it finally, the coin dropped. I said, oh my gosh, Paul Ekman, Philip Dick, they're related institutionally. Not only that, they're related politically, because the system that Paul Ekman helped to institutionalize and normalize was the very system that PKD was warning us against. Do you see that? The Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute, PKD, Paul Ekman. And I'm bringing it together for you here. We're enjoying this insight together. I'm debuting it. No one has heard this before. Not even my closest friends, because they're not interested. I say, well, so what? I'm going to go see my shrink and I got to fill my prescription of Prozac, right? We're the Prozac nation, right? Read Dr. Peter Bregan, read his take on the Prozac nation or the psychotropic drug so-called. And again, I'm not trying to put you down here, and I'm not going to put down psychotherapy and psychotherapy. You've seen my talk on Jeffrey Masson, right? Who wrote a book called Against Therapy, and he repudiates the whole Freudian, Jungian, all of it. He repudiates the whole psychotherapeutic power relationship. And speaking for myself, I do too, right? Because nobody's the boss of me. I'm the boss of me. I have a direct relationship to, the people that are the boss of me, but they certainly aren't people in a white coat. And if you want to read more about, and I'll finish up with Ekman in a moment. I'm thorough, if nothing else. I've got his autobiography. That's Dr. Paul Ekman. Nonverbal Messages, Cracking the Code, My Life's Pursuit. He thinks he's cracked the code of behavior, right? He thinks he's got it down. He can read your and mine, according to this show, Lie to Me, right? This I don't know, maybe 20 episodes total, starring Eric Roth. We can't hold anything back from Dr. Ekman and his associates. He can see right into our soul. He knows what we are thinking. He knows if we've been bad or good. So be good, for goodness sake, especially good as the central bankers define it, right? The people in the city of London or in Wall Street, they define what is good, the summum bonum in life. And it's people like Dr. Paul Ekman who have been set up as the inquisitors, right? Like the Grand Inquisitor, right? That novel, that novella, that short story within the larger novel, the Brothers Karamazov. Am I pronouncing it right? The Brothers Karamazov? Oh, the Brothers Karamazov. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the person I interviewed a while back. The Grand Inquisitor, which I read, by the way, in a political science class as an undergraduate under Professor Mandelman, because he was the one that kind of turned me onto the whole anti-psychiatric, psychotherapeutic establishment. He gave me warning, and man, that was really good information that I picked up through him. But I didn't know about Paul Ekman back then. So you can read about it, and it lists here on the book cover this Professor Emeritus, University of California, San Francisco, founder, Paul Ekman Group, LLC, Limited Liability Corporation. So we're, Dr. Paul Ekman and myself, we have something in common. We're both Professor Emeritus at the University of California. The difference is he's a multimillionaire with a yacht probably and world famous. And, I'm drawing Social Security, and I'm on whatever pension I was able to put into the UC system. I'm not complaining. I chose my path, and it wasn't his. Now, I'm going to go very briefly through his background here. From a very early stage in his career, he was getting celebrity clients because I guess he was doing psychotherapeutic work as well as doing theoretical work, trying to put together the Ekman method of finding out who's lying. And I was interested in finding out that two of his more famous celebrity clients in Chicago were Mike Nichols, the director Mike Nichols, right? And his writing partner, and they were a comedy team in the 50s, which I don't need to go into, but they really shined. They excelled when they moved into movies, writing movies and directing. That's Mike Nichols and Elaine May. Mike Nichols and Elaine May were both patients of Paul Ekman, to tell you. And I think that's really where he came to the attention of the higher ups and say, hey, let's recruit this young guy, Ekman. I think he has a lot of possibility. We're going to make him into the king of lie detection so that everybody who are brought into this neuropsychiatric behavioral control grid will know that you cannot escape scrutiny. It's a form of surveillance, right? Dick talked about the scanner suits and the physical surveillance, right? The BlackBerries of their time, right? He dealt with that. but he was also dealing with the inner self-surveillance that are being implanted in post-war humanity. Wasn't that the premise of A Scanner Darkly? There's a cop who winds up surveilling himself. I think if I remember correctly, that's what went on there. So that's the point we're at here. You don't have to worry about the so-called CHACOM social credit score, right? That's something external to us. What about that internalized self-surveillance system that we have ingested, that we have been normalized into, that we've been groomed into by the likes of Dr. Paul Ekman, who could peer right into our evil soul like a medieval inquisitor who goes from town to town to find out who are the heretics and to point out the witches who shall be burned at the stake. Right? That's his role. He is an inquisitor. That is why this obsession with the truth and revelation and honesty has been institutionalized, not to protect us from the evildoers, but to create a whole population who stands naked under the gaze of the people in power. And this is something that no medieval lord, that no daimyo in Japan, or no what? El Jefe in Mexico, they could only dream of the type of control, the psychosocial and behavioral and physical, mental, and spiritual control that are imposed on us here today, 2021. Why do you think there was such rapid assent or consent to the biomedical regime that we've seen imposed on us over the last year and a half? Because the behavioral scientists, like Paul Ekman, said in consultation with their colleagues at the WHO, they said, okay, we've done our job. We've had 3-4 generations who have been brought into the program. They've internalized it. They've institutionalized it. We have made psychotherapy into our secular religion. We have groomed all the wounded people, right? Just like a molester grooms his target before he ever makes a move on it. And I say he because most of them are men. Before they ever make a move on the target, they just sort of present an avuncular, fatherly, grandfatherly disposition, right? Look at Paul Ekman's photo, his portrait today. This is like somebody's grandfather. How could he be such a nasty piece of work? Right? It's the whole good cop, bad cop deal all the way. You know, you're reading Annie Jacobson, right? Who is a synthetic author, by the way. She's a team of writers under the name of Annie Jacobson. You're reading her and she's talking about MK Ultra, or you're reading Anthony Burgess, who comes out of British intelligence, by the way. You're reading Clockwork Nassau Orange, right? Clockwork Orange, and you're seeing, the Droogs, and you're seeing Roddy McDowell having his eyes pulled back and being brutalized. So that's what you think mind control is, right? The whole theme, the whole emphasis here that I've been leading to in today's talk is that far more deadly, far more devious, and far more influential is the benevolent form of mind control that we are seeing through these helping professionals, such as Dr. Paul Ekman. Isn't that true? I think he's on the phone now. He's trying to reach me. So you tell me if my argument holds any water. I want you to check out Doc, and again, I think I'll have to do a full workup on him, right, on Dr. Paul Ekman. But you tell me if this is not really at the bottom of our current crisis. It's the benevolent grooming that has been inflicted on generations of Americans now, and people all over the world, and Americans in particular, have really been, especially in women in particular, have been slammed hard by the psychotropics, by the Prozac-nation, and by the psychotherapy, right? I gave a talk earlier on Mr. Rogers, right, and where he comes from, right? A psychologist, a child psychologist from Columbia University was his consultant. And I said, we're going to put those values into a television show paid for by the American public under the guise of public television, right? And we're going to train a few generations of Americans to submit to Mr. Rogers, to Dr. Paul Ekman. And we won't have to have a jackbooted type of Nazi Third Reich type of control system. They're going to be policing themselves, right? Flow my tears, the policeman said. That's a novella by Philip Dick, right? I've already mentioned A Scanner Darkly. And that's going to be much more effective. And the beauty of it is the people themselves will not even know. They won't even be aware of their own enslavement, right? So spread the word. These people who are the inquisitors, they are in earlier times, they would be confessors, right? You go to the confessional booth. I learned this from Father, or who he was a father. He left the church. Malachi Martin. He has a whole book on confession and how the church used confession in order to get into the heads and understand the problems of the population. And they would take that knowledge and figure out how they can control the population on the basis of what they were getting through what today we would call a psychotherapy session, or through these child psychology, developmental psychology sessions, right? These farm schools that are usually attached to the universities. They're studying children. I call them chillin', not children. They call them children. I call them chillin', because children are the ones that run wild like a boogie chillin', right? So be a chillin', not a child. Look what happened to Dick, right? Fortunately, I think his legacy has redeemed him and somehow helped to soften the suffering, the personal suffering and torment that he had to endure, and the type of torment that he inflicted on his poor wives. By the way, I mentioned UC Davis here, and it keeps popping up in weird places, and it showed up in this book. I'll just read it really quickly before I sign off for today. Thank you for putting up with me today, ladies and gentlemen. It's by Tessa B. Dick, My Life on the Edge of Reality. And I checked this out. I found out that her story is true. Right. I looked up this guy that she mentioned, and I got all his articles, and he was at UC Davis in the psychology department. And by the way, it was there was some colleagues in the psychology department who tried to screw me over. Right. A couple of Asian American, they were like Asian American mental health specialists. All they were trying to do is get Asian American people to into this system that Philip Dick was in. So here it is. It says, I have tried to locate this article. It's by a guy named Stanley Cooper Smith. I found him. He was at Davis. The article, Studies in Self-Esteem. See, they're always interested in how good we feel, right? In the February 1968 issue of X magazine, whatever it is. It says, Cooper Smith described it as a longitudinal study conducted by UC Davis in Northern California, and that got my attention. Says, but it must be related to the study at Farragut Elementary. This is in Southern California that she took the test. So I did the work that she had started and closed the circles. Yeah, she too was part of a program, Tessa Dick. And by the way, all of us are part of a program, right? Think back on your childhood education. Think back to the number 2 pencils. Think back to all the different meetings that you never knew why you were there. Right? How you were sorted in following a certain track, right? And how we are continued to be moved into a certain direction. And we think we are exercising our free will, and we're doing it voluntarily, right? But don't fear. We can recover, right? That's the law of the universe, right? We can go through all this, right? Philip Dick could be subjected to sodomy and psychiatric control, but he wrote literature that we're still benefiting from today in 2021. And on that uplifting note, ladies and gentlemen, I will bid you adieu, and I'll see you back on Thursday. It's my favorite day of the week because I get to be on the Thursday trio. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Take care now. Bye.